Welcome back. On this lecture, we will calculate the earnings per share for Apple and Microsoft. What is earnings per share, or EPS? Well, EPS serves as an indicator of a company's profitability. It is calculated as a company's profit divided by the outstanding shares of its common stock. EPS indicates how much money a company makes for each of its share of its stock and is a widely used metric for corporate profits. A higher EPS indicates more value because investors will pay more for a company with higher profits. EPS can be arrived at in several forms, such as including extraordinary items or discontinued operations, or on a diluted basis. Here, we'll focus on two types of EPS, basic and diluted EPS. Before we get into that, what is the main difference between basic and diluted earnings per share? Well, diluted earnings per share, or diluted EPS for short, calculates a company's earnings per share if all convertible securities were converted to common stock. For example, converting securities generally lowers EPS, and as such, diluted earnings per share tends to always be lower to be a lower EPS. The key point here is that diluted EPS is a conservative metric when it indicates a worst case scenario in terms of EPS. So now let's get into it for Apple and see how this is calculated. For Apple, we had net income for the year of $57.4 billion. We then have basic weighted average shares of 17.3 billion. And then we have the diluted weighted average shares of 17.5. So now we have basic EPS of 57.4 billion divided by 17.3 billion. This gives us basic EPS of $3.31. And then for the diluted EPS, we calculate an amount of $3.28. So what does this mean? It means that Apple generates around $3.28 of diluted earnings for each common share that's in the market. Now let's calculate the EPS for Microsoft. We'll use the same formula and we'll use net income divided by the weighted average number of shares. For Microsoft, they had net income of $44.3 billion for the year. And then they had basic weighted average shares of 7,610. They then had diluted weighted average shares of 7,683. When we take net income over the weighted average shares, we come up with basic EPS of $5.82. And then for the year, we also had diluted earnings per share of $5.76. So what does this mean and how does it compare to Apple? This tells us that Microsoft generates around $5.76 of diluted earnings per share. As compared to Apple that we saw in the earlier slide, we can see that for each share, Microsoft is able to generate more earnings per share as compared to Apple.